In order to really adapt to change and the unpredictable times that we're living in at the moment, disruption is very much part of that strategy. For example, we've seen global events around the world that have really created new levels of digital supply chain disruption, and companies now understand the need to digitize the supply chain for flexibility, for adaptability, and for agility. And disruption today also happens faster and faster, and it's coming from directions that we're not even aware about. There are new tools, there are new players. So why do we disrupt? And when and where is it time to disrupt? Well, aligned with today's theme of reimagining the supply chain, our next speaker is going to dive into this topic of disruption. Märtha Rehnberg is the co-founder and partner of Dare Disrupt, a Nordic think tank and consultancy specialized in responsible disruption and exponential technology. She was also awarded Best Sustainable Speaker 2021 last year here in Sweden. So I say a warm welcome up on stage to Märtha Rehnberg.
When you think of it, we are the only species that so mindfully and purposefully produce goods and services, not only for the survival of our own families, but for the survival of people we will never meet. These beautiful words are unfortunately not my own, but those that are to Karl Marx, actually one of the most critical thinkers to our current economic system. And whether you agree or not to the ideology that followed, I personally find a lot of solace in these words. In times of fire NATOs, mass extinctions, you name it. In times of us needing to talk about sustainability, I find a lot of solace in these words because it gives me allowance to kind of say thank you to the old before I embrace and welcome the new. Now, at the center of today is sustainability and technology is certainly the object of my research for the past 10 years. And we wouldn't have supply chains without technology. You know, before we had this kind of almost love story that Marx talked about, our supply chains were very, very simple. We extracted and we processed and we consumed raw material in one and the same place. In comes technology, and for the first time with the steam revolution, we were able to separate all these activities across time and space. We could extract raw material from one space, process it in a second space, and consume it in a third place. With every industrial revolution, our supply chains have become more and more complex. We've been also quite elongated from where we take raw material to where we consume it. Longer and longer supply chains and even more complex. Somewhere around the 90s, economists like myself started talking about smiling curve of economics, meaning that certain activities were more profitable and therefore we kept them here in the West and outsourced low profit added activities to low income countries where there was cheap labor. Now with technology, digital technology today, we see huge transformation of these supply chains and a needed transformation. Now, if you're a tech lover like myself, we have to look at these curves that we saw in the IPCC report of 2018, what we also call the Great Acceleration. Now, when we look at these daunting exponential curves before turning to exponential technology that we hype so much, we need to realize and recognize that we would never be able to exponentially deplete our Earth without the use of technology. Now, during the pandemic, we got this magic moment in time where climate researchers were able to see, you know, what happened during these weeks when we didn't fly, we didn't produce, how coupled are we actually, our economic system, to the natural system? We unfortunately saw the data is out. CO2 didn't decrease fast enough, NOx, SOx, you name it. And when it comes to biodiversity, which is the big agenda for the coming decade as well, we see daunting figures here too. Now, when we look at these technologies, we have the chance to use them to do exactly what we've done always, just faster and more efficiently. Or we have the opportunity to, dare I say, upgrade humanity, maybe the biggest promotion we've ever faced. But we need to show up and we need to have the right intuition to gauge when are we using them to do incremental innovation versus disruptive innovation. And the timing is more important than ever. If you think of it, during the pandemic, we all rushed to this virtual global experiment. Where did actually all the money go on Wall Street, on the stock exchange? Now, we talk a lot about us becoming super users and teams overnight, and digital strategies being implemented overnight super fast. And while that is interesting, I'd like for us to think about what actually happened when all that money rushed to the big tech companies. We talk less about what happened with Microsoft or the other developers of the key digital infrastructure upon which these technologies thrive. Technologies like 3D printing, blockchain, you name it. So if we, before the pandemic, had a timeline of, 10, 20 years on these technologies, it's a good idea to revisit them in light of this boost and pressure that these big tech companies got to be able to help us with the global virtual experiment we're currently in. Now, the pandemic is also this interesting social moment in time where we're able to think of these radical solutions now more than ever. Your customers are experiencing it and requiring it, your talent, your financiers even. And for me, there was no better moment than to look back at what happened a couple of months personally into the pandemic. And I'm sharing you here from my phone pictures that I took of myself together with my colleagues in front of our office that literally burned to the ground. And now no one was hurt, but seeing those pictures, I'm thinking, why do we look so happy almost? And I'll share some of the videos. Well, you're here in the background. We're kind of walking around in what's left of the office. We're laughing, good ambiance. Dennis here is playing piano and what's left of the piano. For me, this moment in time was like, 2020. So this notion of thinking radically is very relative to the moment we're in. And so what radical solutions we could promote before the pandemic, now we have a bigger momentum to do it. Again, your customers, talent, are expecting it and demanding it. And while we have this moment in time, I'm also though feeling that there's a window of opportunity that might be closing. Because if we can't imagine the new, it might just be safer to stick to the old thing. After all, what we cannot imagine, we cannot become. So at the center of my work is what future scholars call the sociology of expectations, or the performativity of expectations. In essence, what this means is that our visions, dreams, hopes about the future actually have a performative effect on our actions in the present. So for us, it doesn't really mean to have a magic crystal ball as a futurist, try to predict the future. It's more about, can you visualize and vocalize visions that are powerful enough about the future that they create the powerful actions in the present? Actions that might be able to attract the right talent around you that want to be part of this vision. And after talent comes the financial capital. And this is where you actually start seeing a self-fulfilling prophecy of many of those visions. And I'd like to share kind of 3 visions that are especially exciting for me, where I stand when it comes to sustainable supply chains. And the first one is within governance, where we're finally moving from a space of sustainability where it was almost about fake news. You could define for yourself what was sustainable and what wasn't, to now with things like the EU taxonomy on sustainable finance, first time in history, a supranational institution goes in and tries to define what is sustainable and what is not sustainable. Affects the cost of capital of all of the companies in the EU. But beyond the borders of EU, you have actors like Larry Fink, CEO of the largest asset manager in the world, who says that for them, climate risk is a financial risk. It's not an altruistic goal here. They're using quite neat tools to go in and have radical transparency and better use of data as one of the big topics for today. Now, spatial finance is probably one of my pet areas to look into at this moment, where you actually start seeing Wall Street become science-based and become woke, not trusting the companies they have invested in globally that might still be in this fake news space of sustainability, where they say, I won't trust the data you're giving me. I'll instead log into the satellites in real time and look, where are the emissions? Where is the SOx? Where is the NOx? And here you can actually see where this space not only relates to climate, but also biodiversity. So here is a company where they've looked throughout 2016, about 2001 to 2016, how this company actually has deforested mostly their area more than they've said to their financiers. Or here another example in Cambodia. And so, for me, this radical transparency space and governance, this top-down space of using data better, hopefully will get us out of a space of out of sight, out of mind economy, where we just outsource both externalities related to climate or social issues. And this leads me into the next, because what is the big why when Larry Fink says such a thing as climate risk is a financial risk? Where we're looking into the next generation as talents, but also, as said, investors. And they're even going beyond sustainability. They don't want to just be sustained, they want to regenerate. And here you have players like Microsoft, again mentioned, wanting to be carbon negative by 2030, but by 2050, they want to even have offset the entire value chain since their creation in the 80s. Or players like IKEA that want to be climate positive by 2030. Ørsted, they talk about biodiversity and net positive impact on biodiversity through their wind farms. And now these are the big kind of heavy asset players, but we're seeing it in the B2C space as well. Here was me on the train on my way from Copenhagen yesterday. The guy next to me was sleeping, so I had to kind of, sorry for the kind of skewed angle here on the picture. But for those Swedish speakers out there, you might see the title here, A Real Garbage Shoe. Now we're trying to proudly just promote these shoes as being real garbage shoes. They're made out of waste from the ocean. We think that is totally normal today, but it is a shift from sustainability to regenerative. A shift that was first created by Adidas Parley many, many years back. 9 years ago, they had to pitch this to the board. Imagine this pitch. We're going to take waste from the ocean. We're going to turn it into a shoe, and it's going to be sold out every single time, and it's going to be okay to pay a premium for this shoe. Ridiculous 9 years ago, but yet today feels totally normal. So what if every product was a gift back to nature? Something to think about. Again, driven by this new generation. And we do talk about the new generation, but we don't really talk about this new generation. The great transfer of wealth that we've ever seen throughout history is happening in the next decade, where you have boomers giving to millennials and generations below them up towards 100 trillion US dollars. Now let's think of this generation as the Greta Thunbergs of the world, but with money. With money. Let's look into how this generation thinks and what they value. Well, in broad terms, they value access over ownership, so dematerialized business models. They want to take a pay cut. Up to 90% of this generation is okay to take a pay cut to work in a company that puts purpose above profit. Related to boomers, it's about 1 in 6 with boomers. And it's not only the Greta Thunbergs in high-income countries. You see this globally, especially out of the pandemic. In India, up towards 70% in this consumer area of millennials are okay to choose a brand that is less known but more sustainable. And on my last signal here, it might be a little weird and ridiculous to take with you, but they buy twice as much houseplants as generations before them, at least in the US. Now, is this ridiculous? Or might this be telling of a paradigm shift within my next era, which is technology? I've followed technology for more than 10 years now. I worked with the techies for more than 10 years. And I do see a shift in their mindset, in their values. Techies now are falling in love with nature at a deeper level. And they want to not use tech to master nature, which was the era of industrialization up until now. Now they want to use tech to mimic nature. Scholars in this field, have told me, think of nature as a research and development department. When you think of it, nature is this 3 to 4 billion year old R&D department. The most badass R&D department we have that has over these up towards 4 billion years perfected all the products we have around us. So now techies are using tech to try to understand these mysteries and reverse engineer the solutions found in nature. Metaphorically, we see this with things like 3D printing, right? Building products layer per layer, zero waste when we do it well. just like nature. And we have to use artificial intelligence to help us design these products because it's almost alien-looking structures to design according to nature. But at the core of these distributed systems is also the new business models, right? We need to think of, okay, so this new generation that wants not only ownership, but they want access instead. So here we see Adidas going at the forefront saying, you know what, in 2027, this is their vision. They want us to go in as consumers, scan our shoes and have, scan our foot and have shoes 3D printed hours later, perfected at the perfect size to our foot. And now when you have production that close to the end consumer, the retail has become kind of a factory. You can have these circular models, and they're envisioning kind of a Spotify for shoe, where you don't own the shoe, but you just access the shoe. And months later, when the shoe has broken, you turn it in again and back into the shredder, and you print another upgraded shoe, perfected and developed according to the way you run. So that's interesting when we talk about supply chain sustainability, right? And we see the difference here. We can use 3D printing to spit out more mass-produced products, or when we do a good crossing with other technologies and bet on a new generation, we can actually dematerialize our supply chains. And the value changes here. All of a sudden, value is in manufacturing and the shortening of supply chains. Now, this is the first time since industrialization started, where industrialization was all about separating. Now we have a shortening of the supply chains. And what this does at a conceptual level is move us towards an era of distribution. This is something I'm showing you from the 60s, Paul Barron, who was asked by the US defense authorities to design a communication system that was sturdy enough for the Russians back then not being able to take that system out. And so he said, we need to move from a system that is centralized, whereby if you know the central node, you can just take that out and you'll take the entire system out. Move away from that towards one of distribution, where you take out a node and they kind of have the system healing itself like an organism. And this is what we're seeing with distributed production systems, everyone having a bit of production everywhere. And at the center of it is distributed energy system, because we couldn't have distributed production systems without things like renewable energy, right? And here you see at the very literal sense what this distributed system means. Here outside of Kiev a couple of weeks ago, the Russians indeed had tried to bomb the energy system of a solar farm, and the solar farm was up and running hours later. Now, if this was a centralized energy system like nuclear power or fossil fuels, you would have seen a radically different picture here. And this is how we start designing systems like nature. But we can be even more literal here. When we have these clean energy systems neatly available, we can use things like carbon capture, take CO2 from the atmosphere and produce totally new products. Again, nature sees CO2 not as a foe, but just as building blocks for creating new products. Or the next generation of energy, because maybe we can't have all these solar farms when we have biodiversity agenda becoming more and more pressing. So in order for us to be smarter, again, we turn towards nature. There is nothing better than photosynthesis to turn energy into our availability. And here you see, in fact, this technology based on photosynthesis, where an algae-covered building is making this building carbon neutral. So here you see solar energy built only on algae. The next signal I'll show you is biocomputing. And this gets really weird, so stay with me. But again, we turn towards nature to find the next era of computing, because we're not sure we can have these big data centers creating so much material and energy. So why not turn to nature's ability to store data for us? And here, it's DNA. DNA is the best store of data. So that's the new paradigm, perhaps, from data centers to DNA-based data storage. New York Genome Institute went together with the National Library in the US to see if they could fit the entire National Library data into one drop of DNA. And they succeeded a couple of months into the pandemic. Around the same time that Microsoft said, you know what, we're also betting on this. And it's not only the big players, there's also a biohacker in Copenhagen that I work with who's used this technology to upload her favorite Spotify playlist into her houseplant. I don't know if you feel like this right now. This is how I feel often. And there it's important for us to not just think about what the technology does, but what story it represents. This is what helps me navigate when the technology becomes a bit more overwhelming. And the story that it represents at the moment is one of upgrading, one of looking towards nature as this beautiful creative constraint for innovation. And this is my takeaway. Whether we use science-based as creative constraint or nature of creative constraint, it is one of the most beautiful creative constraints now for innovation. But you need to tread lightly. And there's a lot of different things here. I'm not saying you're going to use biocomputing tomorrow, but certain no-regret moves for us to do so ethically is to try to embrace a lot of paradoxes. One is when we use these technologies to work with both an innovation principle and a precautionary principle to test, but also have short feedback loops where we can learn and unlearn as we learn more about nature. So calibrate in real time with the latest science out there. Next paradox is about high tech, low tech, no tech better. When do we use crazy things like biocomputing, or whether no tech is the best solution for us? Here it's about the real incentives we put in place. The technology we've used for the past 50 years, we've actually managed to, in relative terms, decouple our economic system from nature by about 30% in relative terms. That means for every dollar in the global economy, we've decreased the CO2 intensity with about 30%. But in absolute term, in a growing economy, the CO2 in the atmosphere has increased with 300%. So we need to incentivize our use of tech to do not relative decoupling, but absolute decoupling. The next tough cookie and paradox for us is that we need to think of those visions that have the power of pull to attract the right talent and playmates. And we need to be radically compliant at the same time. There's kind of a left brain, right brain exercise we need to do at the same time. And this is a tough one. This is why I think at the center of it is inviting new playmates, artists, biologies to our playground. If we do so, if we also dare to do this radical innovation instead of just incremental innovations, I think we'll be part of this promotion of Marx's original love story, which is not about just expanding love to people we will never meet, but expanding love to species, animals, plants that we will never fully understand, and also to a planet that might not even say thank you in return. But if that's not the most badass promotion humanity has ever faced, I don't know what is. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Märtha, for so eloquently really illustrating how technology and humanity and nature really can couple together to pave the way forward for humanity. It sort of reminds me of another quote, that beauty can save the world, which I think Fyodor Dostoevsky once said, and you sort of encapsulated that. I just want sort of like a practical note. What would you say on the theme of sort of reimagining the supply chain? Looking at all of the things that you said, on a practical note, looking at the supply chain that is sort of nodes in nodes, it's a whole chain. What is sort of a practical daily incentive that you could give to the viewers to really, have to integrate towards this kind of vision that you're talking about?
Well, I alluded a little bit in the last comment. I found a lot of comfort in opening up the playmates around me. So people that I usually think that I work with in my supply chain might not be those that will inspire me to think of these radical solutions. So how can we find those crossings of other industries that might do something where, wait a minute, there could be a link towards me. And I think there's something of nurturing a more diverse playgrounds that is really at the core of kind of nurturing this mindset as well.
So nurturing diversity in a whole spectrum.
Yeah, I'd say.
John, any questions from our viewers?
Yes, we actually have one so far,
Cool.
which is there a shortcut to becoming technologically intuitive? What advice would you give a newcomer to the area?
Oh, fantastic, brilliant question. I'd say one of the major hacks is change your news feed. The traditional media is kind of building on the negativity bias that we have, so you kind of need to very purposefully change the news input and new people to follow. I could send a little list. I don't know how I could do that, but maybe on LinkedIn, if you could hook me up, of really cool people to follow, because you need to train this as a muscle. I think you need to see it as a muscle. You need to train every day to get new input, as well as what I said earlier. Also talk to people about these things, not only read about them. And then for that, you might have to open up the people you talk to new people.
Thank you.
Any more?
No, not at this point.
Not at this
But
point.
once again, I urge the entire audience to send in more questions, and you might have an opportunity to ask another question of Märtha later when she is in the sustainability panel.
Yes.
So looking really much
Bring it
forward to
on.
those questions.
Thank you.
Märtha, thank you so much for the work that you do and for your
Thank you.
presentation and for
Thank you,
being such a
Sabine.
source of inspiration.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.